The lesson tonight is on Job. We have a lesson here on Job. Now, as soon as I saw the title, I thought a certain thing here. It says, Job, a patient sufferer. And I put down, it's not a suffering patient. He's a patient suffering, a patient sufferer. And actually, in my talking to Derek, actually, I'll give him credit for this. I asked him if he'd read the book of Job, because he seems to be going through so much, and I thought maybe if he'd read that, he could see that God can undertake. Sometimes it takes a while. And I didn't know how long that Job had gone through this. Has anybody ever heard any estimation of how long Job's suffering was? And somehow he come up with, and he had heard that 7 years. Can you imagine the suffering that Job was going through, and 7 years of it? 7 years of those boils and things on his body. Yeah, there's the Bible. It's a Bible number. It sure is. That is a long time to suffer the way he might have suffered. And I don't know. Maybe when the three friends got there, they looked at him. Just sat there and looked at him for 2 weeks, for 14 days or so. Something. He just sat there and looked at him. And that wouldn't be good. You wouldn't feel good at that. Just somebody sitting there, you're sick, and they're just sitting there looking at you. It just don't. So I don't. Maybe some of these things they would say, and it might be another day or two before Job would answer, and then another 4 or 5 days until they'd answer him again, and so forth. I don't know, because the reading the book. It don't take very long, just a few minutes, 15 or 20 minutes at the most, maybe less. But so there might have been a lot of other things that they said to Job throughout that period of time. But let's get into in James. And I was also thinking about the faith of Job, but it's in the scripture there in James 5:11. You have heard of the patience of Job, and have seen the end of the Lord, that the Lord is very pitiful and of tender mercy. Now that word pitiful, in the day it was written, meant he was full of pity. Not that he was a pitiful situation, that the Lord's a pitiful person. No, no. God's not pitiful the way we look at the word pitiful nowadays. There's a lot of pitiful situations that we would call pitiful, but he's full of pity. That's what that word means. And the central truth is trust in God is the key element in enduring trials. We can trust God for everything. He knows the end from the beginning. So therefore, we can trust him for everything. Okay, Job 1:1, and we only covered chapter 1, but there's a reason, and I'll touch on that too, I believe. Sometimes I think we get too in depth, and there's 40-some chapters in Job, and we could really get into what each one of these guys said, and we say, well, if Bildad and Eliphaz and Zophar said this, and they're not exactly correct. Sounds good. Some of the things they say sound real good, but we could pick apart what they have to say. I'll touch on that. It's not necessarily in our, at the end. I'm going to get into a little bit more than what is there. The scripture reads like this for the first 3 verses. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was perfect and upright, and one that feared God and eschewed evil. And there was born unto him 7 sons and 3 daughters. His substance also was 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 she-asses, and a very great household, and so that this man was the greatest of all the men of the east. And by the way, 500 yoke of oxen, that means there's 2 to a yoke. That was 1,000 oxen there. Okay, some Jewish traditions ascribe the book of Job to Moses, others to a variety of leaders, including Elihu, Solomon, Isaiah, Hezekiah, and Baruch. Jeremiah's scribe. It says the text itself gives no clue to the authorship, so it remains anonymous. This literary treasure asks questions and gives answers that have intrigued Christians for years. It is probably the oldest book of the Bible and tells of a man in the land of Uz. It is not clear where this land is located. And then it goes ahead and says what is important is the central character, the central character of a grand conspiracy that took place between God and Satan. Job was perfect and upright, feared God, and had nothing to do with evil. Now, as I looked at some of these things here, it's said to be by some that it's the oldest book of the Bible, or the account that's given is the oldest account that we can refer to in the Bible. This happened before, we don't even know how long before. Some of the stories might have been carried from one side of the flood to the other. But I'm thinking that it's probably on this side of the flood, because the land of Uz. Now, when you're reading in the genealogy of some of the descendants of Abraham, right close to Abraham, within the second or third generation, there was a Huz and a Buz. They were brothers. And there are people who believe that this Huz is the same one that was of the land of Uz, or had the people that lived in this area, wherever it was, and it just became Uz. So that's one thing to think about. And my pick, my choice or guess of who wrote it, my first pick would be Elihu. I made mention of his three friends just a moment ago, but there were four men sitting around beside Job. Elihu was the youngest of all of them. And it's good to read. It's a good book to read, especially if you're going through trials and you recall and you realize that Job went through all this trouble, and even maybe for 7 years. That's a long time. But I like it when Zophar, Bildad, Eliphaz had their say, and Job had his rebuttal to what they had to say, and then God began to speak to Job. But I don't know whether that's first or not, but Elihu, when he gets to talking, he says, listen, I come here to learn. I'm a young man. I'm younger than all of you. You're all old men. I want to come to learn wisdom from you. I wanted to learn from you. But he said, I found out that great men are not always wise. But he lets into them. He lets into all of them. I think he gets Job in there too. He begins to say, yeah, I don't think y'all know what you're talking about. And I mean, I'm using my own language, and it's good to read what he has to say. And he's got a bunch of verses. I think he just goes on a tirade against them all. But so my second choice would be Moses, to be the one, especially if it's the oldest book or an account of the oldest thing that ever happened that's recorded in the Bible. So that would be my two. The others would be so much later, it wouldn't have been the oldest book. Or, of course, it's still an account of the oldest, an older account, I mean. But anyway, about verse 2, Job is described as a man that was blessed by having 7 sons and 3 daughters. He was evidently in his middle age because his children were grown and had families. Yet Job was not too old to have a new family, as we'll see later. 7 sons and 3 daughters. They had a feast every day. Each son had a feast each day, and the daughters were always invited to their feasts, and that's how they worked it, and so on. Job was also a very wealthy man. He was blessed with material goods, many servants, many employees. He had a reputation of being the most powerful man in the East. I heard him talking on the bus the other day about Rothschild, and it made me think of the John Birch Society and the Trilateral Committee that controls the world now, you know. Well, maybe they do, maybe they don't, and so on. But if you got enough money, you can do a lot of controlling. And Job might have been the most powerful man, and he was a good man. Description being perfect and upright and not having anything to do with evil. If there was anything going on, then it was going the right direction, not going the wrong direction that the world seems to be going today. Okay, now we get into verse 4. That was called a godly man. And then the second section is called a devilish scheme. The devil's always up to schemes. He's out to get everybody. Right before he was asked where he come from, he said, I'm come from going to and fro in the earth and seeking whom I may devour. And that's what his business is. So what? And we break into verse 8 and says, and the Lord said unto Satan, hast thou considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and an upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil? Then Satan answered the Lord and said, Does Job fear God for naught? Hast thou not made a hedge about him and about his house and about all that he hath on every side? Thou hast blessed the work of his hands, and his substance is increased in the land. But put forth thy hand now and touch all that he hath, and he will curse thee to thy face. Ooh. The devil's also the accuser of the brethren. He's always accusing somebody. And the Lord said unto Satan, Behold, all that he hath is in thy power, only upon himself put not forth thine hand. So Satan went forth from the presence of the Lord. And I noticed this, and I'm not sure that very many bring this up, but Satan said, God, you afflict him. And God don't do that. So he said, I'm letting you have him. He's in your hand. You can do what you want to him. Yeah, except touch his body. And so the next time that Satan came, well, then God allowed him to afflict his body but not take his life. But I noticed that. And there's a point there to be made. God doesn't tempt people with evil. He doesn't send bad things. In fact, I might have a little bit of, if I can remember, I'll have something here. And there was a day when the sons and his daughters were eating and drinking in their eldest brother's house. I noticed the eldest brother, and they talk about in the commentary that he might have waited a few days. He might have waited till he got to the eldest son's house. Might have waited a week or so. And there came a messenger unto Job and said, The oxen were plowing and the asses feeding beside them, and the Sabaeans fell upon them and took them away. Yea, they have slain the servants with the edge of the sword, and I only am escaped to tell thee. While he was yet speaking, there come also another, and said, The fire of God is fallen from heaven, and hath burned up the sheep and the servants, and consumed them. And I only am escaped alone to tell thee. While he was yet speaking, there came also another, and said, The Chaldeans made out 3 bands, and fell upon the camels, and have carried them away, yea, and slain the servants with the edge of the sword, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee. While he was yet speaking, there came also another, and said, Thy sons and thy daughters were eating and drinking wine in their elder brother's house. And behold, there came a great wind from the wilderness, and smote the 4 corners of the house. And it fell upon the young men, and they are dead, and I only am escaped to tell thee. I think I've heard that trouble sometimes comes in 3s. We got 4 here. I mean, you might complain about the 3s, but we got 4 here. So that's in the prior verses before verse 8. Satan is going through the land, as I told you, and he came to the presence of God. God's prize man Job was held up before Satan as an incorruptible servant of God. And there's a thought that probably you could get a whole message out of this. Could God tell Satan, here's a servant of mine, and have enough faith in you that whatever Satan would do to you, that you could stay true to God? That's something to think about. I would hope everybody has that same standing that Job had, that same strength, that same trust, that same desire to be God's man. Satan's pouting answer accused God of pampering and blessing Job so much that it would be ridiculous to think that Job would not be faithful. Whether it was true or not, Satan stated that God had built a hedge around protection around Job. Other people Satan could get through to, but not Job. His possessions, wealth, endeavors, family, and his person had been made untouchable. Satan threw out a challenge, change the rules. Drop the fortifications. Then Job will listen to my reasoning and will turn on you and curse you without fear of repercussion. Satan suggested that Job's motivation for righteousness was selfishness. I'm afraid that I've seen some of that. I don't want to accuse anybody, but I think I've seen some of that sometimes around the church, that they like some of the things that's there. But verse 12, at this point, it is important to remember that we are not observing a spiritual dualism of good versus evil. I don't know that I understand what the writer says there, but God and Satan are not equals. I know that. God is sovereign. He alone is God. Satan is a created angel who was degraded by his own sin. Satan is on God's leash. Satan was not only given the leeway that God allows for the probationary purposes of mankind. Satan is on a leash, and he's accountable to God. Still, he's accountable to God, and he has to listen to what God says. The demons, when the one in the demoniac there, they said, "Hey, have you come to torment us before the time?" And well, no, don't guess it was, but anyway, verse 13: Satan takes full advantage of every opportunity to ruin the lives of people. He waited till the family was all together, and as I said, at the eldest son's house, they were enjoying themselves. And then he introduced tragedy. Well, that's a good word. How many of you have seen that insurance commercial about mayhem? He introduced mayhem. Things began to happen. Bad things began to happen, and it just kept on happening. The first sign of this came when a messenger ran up to Job to tell him that the workers in the field had been attacked. The Sabaeans seem to have been one of three different groups, one in Africa and two in Arabia, and it gives you a bunch of places there and so forth, and who they were associated with, sons of Ishmael and so on, that dwelt in an ancient kingdom of Sheba. And that one, I may have to wonder if that's where the Queen of Sheba was from later on, and so on. The 16th verse, the first messenger was still giving the bad news to Job when another ran towards him with more bad news. This time the fire of God had fallen from heaven, and this probably is a reference to lightning. It's interesting that the servants referred to it as being from God. It may be that this was a common way of describing the common this natural phenomenon. And I got it over here. Maybe also Satan was trying to get the lightning from heaven so that people could blame God. You know, there's a lot of times when bad things happen, people blame God. And it wasn't God. Satan is the prince of the power of the air. He could brought the lightning down as well. So I wonder if this was a thing to distract people and to cause them to blame God. It come from heaven. This lightning, this fire came from heaven. A third messenger broke into the dismayed group. You know, here's Job and two messengers, and man, what's going on? So here's another one coming, and he says the Chaldeans have come and took the camels and killed the servants and so forth. And the Chaldeans mentioned here are not to be confused with the 11th dynasty of the kings of Babylon, where the Jews went into captivity. Let's see, that is conventionally known as the historians of the Chaldean dynasty. In Genesis, the Semitic Chaldeans are mentioned. They lived in the mountain ranges lying to the north of Assyria and Mesopotamia, and I get the idea that's where the Kurds are located mostly now, and kind of like northern Iraq and southeastern Turkey and so forth, if I got it right. Now, Satan was relentless in his attack. A fourth messenger came with more news of devastation. The message struck closer to Job's heart. He had less trouble dealing with the loss of possessions and even livestock, but then his family was touched by the hand of evil. You know, the writer here seems to give the fact that the point that Job said, and he said it a little bit later, it was all God's. I think Rodney talks about a lot of times it's all God's. We're stewards at times. He said this morning, we're stewards of what God's doing, things like that. But let me tell you, as long as we have it in our mind that it's God's that owns it, and we're just stewards of it, then there's a lot of things can happen, and it won't bother it as much. But when it's family, that was a little harder to take. I'm sure it was. The third is an unshaken integrity. Then Job arose, rent his mantle, shaved his head, fell down up on the ground, and worshipped. What did he say? He said, naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave. That's where you know that Job says it was God's to begin with. He gave it to me. I could say, I look at all that I did, like Nebuchadnezzar said, look at the great kingdom I've created. But Job didn't have that idea. God gave all this to him, and the Lord taketh away, hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Ooh. Not only did he say the Lord hath given and the Lord hath taken away, but he said, blessed be the name of the Lord. Another example of things being given and taken away was when Abraham was told to sacrifice Isaac. And he was going to do it because he had faith that God could raise Isaac from the dead. It says so in Hebrews there in chapter 11, that he received Isaac, the same as dead anyway. As Abraham was 100 and something, and Sarah was 99 or 100, the same as dead, and he gave him a son. He could raise him up from the dead. And I believe Job is thinking that God gave it to me once. He don't have to give it all back to me, but he can give it back to me. In all this, it says Job sinned not, nor charged God foolishly. And I know that he had the physical problems after this and so on, but I think I could say that he continued still, even to the end of the chapter, in the end of the ordeal, that he never sinned or he never charged God foolishly. In the commentary, it is significant to note Job's response to overwhelming catastrophe. He turned to God in humility and worshiped. No one word of blame fell from his lips. If Satan had taken, if I'm correct, that Satan had that lightning come from heaven to say, well, that come from heaven, that come from God, to blame God, it didn't. Others might have said so, but Job didn't. That didn't come from God. I don't know where it come from. I'm not sure that Job ever really realized what all was going on. But he didn't blame God at all. He recognized that he owed all to God. He was God's man. And what he was and what he had was in God's hand. God gives and God takes away. Who are we to reason why? Who are we to complain when our feeble efforts to understand are inadequate? There's a couple of songs that's almost alike. We'll understand it better by and by. And the other is farther along. We'll understand it. I also thought of an old song. If I can think of all the words again, didn't write them down. I'll ask the questions. He'll tell me why. And we'll understand it in the by and by. It's there's things we don't know, and we can ask the Lord when we get to heaven, and we'll be able to grasp it then. In all this, Job sinned not nor charged God foolishly. This was, and I put down is, the reaction of a righteous man. Now, and then if you want to turn in your Bibles to Job chapter 41, 42, I'm going to read the end of it. Because Job believed, I keep calling him God, but he wasn't God. And some other things. God did restore him, and he actually there was a lot of things that God told to Job there. I thought I had something coming, but anyway, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, they were really jumping on his case. They were saying he sinned because that wouldn't happen to a righteous man. All this stuff wasn't right. You know, you've sinned somewhere, Job. And he kept saying no, he hadn't. And starting with verse 7, and it was so after the Lord had spoken these words unto Job, the Lord said unto Eliphaz the Temanite. Evidently, Eliphaz was the leader of these three, these other two guys. My wrath is kindled against thee, and against thy two friends. For ye have not spoken of me the thing that is right, as my servant Job hath. Therefore take unto you now 7 bullocks and 7 rams, and go to my servant Job, and offer up for yourselves a burnt offering, and my servant Job shall pray for you. For him will I accept. In other words, I'm not going to accept you guys. You're going to have somebody else pray for you. I'm not going to listen to you. Lest I deal with you after your folly, in that you have not spoken of me the thing which is right, like my servant Job. So Eliphaz the Temanite, and Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite went and did according to as the Lord had commanded them. The Lord also accepted Job. Now the Lord turned the captivity of Job, and he prayed for his friends, and the Lord also gave Job twice as much as he had before. How many was it? 10,000. We'll get it back here again. 7,000 sheep, so he had 14,000 sheep at the end. 3,000 camels, so he had 6,000 camels in the end. 500 yoke of oxen, so 1,000 yoke of oxen, that's 2,000 oxen. And 500 she-asses, 1,000 she-asses. And a very great household, which was probably bigger than better and more efficient than it was before. And let me tell you some things. Maybe some of you have heard this, but I want you to hear some of this. 500 yoke of oxen, or the oxen, that was like the John Deere tractors. You know? And all this equipment he had, and the 500 she-asses, that's like Mack trucks, semi-tractor trailers. So he had 1,000. He had 1,000 of them. Hey, if somebody could own 1,000 semi-tractor trailers, he's got some money. You know, and the sheep and the other things there, the camels. The camels in that case was also like utility trucks and things, but it also as it might not be a very good. It might have been like the Lamborghinis and the Rolls Royces. That's the way they got around. I mean, they didn't have too many horses those days. That was the way they got around. And so, but you say, well, he's had 7 sons and 3 daughters. Again, the livestock don't have any souls. His first 7 sons and 3 daughters were saved by his sacrifices. Then he had 7 and 3 again. So he had 14 in heaven, I believe. I believe they'll all be there. I'm looking forward to see. I'll go and find out. 14 sons and 6 daughters. So God has a way of bringing things around. And the situation that we want to look at is stay true to the Lord. Your faith will see you through. God will see you through. You put your faith in God, and He'll see you through. He did Job. Job went through an awful lot of hard time, but God brought him out.